There is a terrifying delusion embedded in the foundation of the American middle class, a belief that if you sign the right mortgage papers, pay your property taxes on time, and build a sturdy fence around your backyard, you can effectively lock the chaos of the world outside your front door. I have spent decades analyzing the psychological architecture of family destruction. And I can assure you that the most devastating financial bombs are never dropped by anonymous corporations or masked thieves. They are detonated by the people sitting across from you at the Thanksgiving dinner table. The people who know exactly where your weak points are because they helped build them. This is the story of Mark, a man who believed he was building a fortress in the affluent suburbs of Denver, Colorado, only to discover that the monster was already living inside the walls. And it carried the title of family. Mark was a structural engineer, a man whose entire professional and personal philosophy was dictated by the unforgiving laws of physics and mathematics. He understood load-bearing walls, stress thresholds, and the absolute necessity of a solid foundation. In a rapidly expanding, aggressively gentrifying city like Denver, where real estate speculation was practically a blood sport, Mark was a rarity. He did not gamble. He spent 10 grueling years working 80-hour weeks at a commercial engineering firm, carefully hoarding every dollar he earned, living in cramped apartments, and driving a battered sedan long after he could afford a luxury vehicle. He was operating on a deeply ingrained, almost pathological need for security, driven by a childhood spent watching his own parents drown in credit card debt. When Mark finally purchased a stunning, mid-century modern home in the highly coveted Cherry Creek neighborhood, it was not merely a real estate transaction. It was the physical manifestation of his survival. He put down a massive down payment, securing a low interest rate, and legally tethered his entire net worth to that specific plot of land. It was his sanctuary. When Mark married Chloe, he believed he was merging his life with a woman who shared his pragmatic vision of the future. Chloe was a freelance interior designer, a woman with a brilliant eye for aesthetics but a terrifyingly naive understanding of financial boundaries. She grew up in a completely different psychological environment than Mark. To understand Chloe, you have to understand the towering, suffocating shadow of her father, Arthur. In the late 1980s and early 90s, Arthur had been a minor titan in the Colorado commercial real estate market. He was the kind of man who wore custom-tailored suits, drove imported sports cars, and closed massive land development deals over expensive scotch at exclusive country clubs. Arthur raised Chloe in an environment of absolute, unquestioned financial abundance, but it was an abundance built entirely on the razor-thin edge of extreme leverage. The psychology of a man like Arthur is a fascinating, horrifying case study in narcissistic financial delusion. When the real estate market inevitably shifted, wiping out his aggressive, highly leveraged portfolios, Arthur did not adapt. He did not accept his losses, downsize his lifestyle, or take a salaried job like a normal human being. A man whose entire ego is tied to the concept of being a high-rolling dealmaker views regular employment as a fate worse than death. Instead, Arthur spent the next 2 decades, chasing the ghost of his former glory. He became a chronic gambler, not in the neon-lit casinos of Las Vegas, but in the unregulated, cutthroat world of shadow banking and high-risk speculative development. He was always just one big deal away from getting it all back. He maintained his country club membership while quietly liquidating his retirement accounts. He projected the aura of a wealthy patriarch while secretly drowning in a sea of aggressive, high-interest debt. And Chloe, conditioned since childhood to view her father as an infallible financial genius, remained entirely blind to his deterioration. She worshipped him, viewing his constant need for short-term cash infusions as temporary setbacks for a brilliant businessman. This toxic father and daughter dynamic is a recognized sociological phenomenon in affluent American families. The daughter becomes the emotional and often financial enabler for the narcissistic father, entirely bypassing the boundaries of her own marriage to protect her father's fragile ego. Mark recognized the red flags early on, but like many men deeply in love, he rationalized them. He tolerated Arthur's condescending remarks about engineering being a blue-collar profession disguised with a degree. He ignored the fact that Arthur never once offered to help pay for the wedding, yet insisted on inviting 50 of his former business associates to maintain appearances. Mark simply drew a hard, silent boundary. He kept his finances strictly separated from Arthur, believing that as long as his name was on the deed to the Cherry Creek house, his sanctuary was impenetrable. But the American financial system has a dark, predatory underbelly designed specifically to exploit desperate men like Arthur. When the traditional banks cut Arthur off, when his credit score plummeted to the point where he could not secure a standard commercial loan, he turned to the shadow lenders. These are not the cinematic mobsters who break your kneecaps in a dark alley. These are highly sophisticated, utterly ruthless private equity firms and hard money lenders operating out of sleek office buildings in downtown Denver. They lend massive amounts of cash at astronomical, predatory interest rates, often exceeding 20 or 30%, and they secure these loans with incredibly aggressive collateral agreements. They do not care if your business plan succeeds. In fact, they prefer that it fails, because their entire business model is built on seizing the collateral and liquidating it for a massive profit. Arthur, completely blinded by his desperation to fund a doomed luxury condominium project on the outskirts of the city, walked right into their trap. He borrowed $700,000 from a predatory lending syndicate, agreeing to terms that practically guaranteed his own financial execution. The inciting incident of Mark's nightmare did not arrive with a dramatic explosion. It arrived on a quiet, freezing Tuesday evening in late November. Mark had just returned home from a grueling day at the engineering firm, exhausted but deeply satisfied as he pulled his car into the heated garage of his beautiful home. He walked into the kitchen expecting to find Chloe, but the house was completely silent. He found her sitting in the dark in the living room, her face pale, her hands trembling violently as she clutched a thick stack of legal documents. Sitting across from her, radiating an aura of frantic, suffocating panic, was Arthur. The facade of the wealthy patriarch had entirely melted away. Arthur looked like a cornered animal. His face was gray, his expensive suit looked suddenly hollow, and his hands were shaking as he desperately tried to explain the unexplainable. I need you to visualize the psychological violence of this moment. Arthur did not come to apologize. He did not come to confess his failures and ask for forgiveness. A narcissist facing complete annihilation will gladly burn down the lives of everyone they love before admitting defeat. Arthur looked at Mark, bypassing any standard human greeting, and launched into a frantic, aggressive monologue. He framed his catastrophic financial ruin not as a consequence of his own reckless gambling, but as a temporary liquidity crisis caused by a corrupt market. He spoke rapidly about the hard money lenders, about the exorbitant interest rates that had compounded daily, swallowing his entire principal loan in a matter of months. The $700,000 debt had ballooned to over $1.2 million, and the syndicate was officially moving to seize every remaining asset he had ever touched. But the true horror, the absolute, blood-chilling secret that Arthur had been hiding from Mark, was how he had secured that predatory loan in the first place. Arthur did not have enough clean collateral to satisfy the shadow lenders. He needed a co-signer, someone with an impeccable credit score, and a verifiable, unencumbered asset. He looked at his daughter, the woman who had been conditioned her entire life to never question him, and he exploited her completely. 8 months prior, while Mark was traveling out of state inspecting commercial bridge structures, Arthur had invited Chloe to a private lunch. He fed her a highly manipulated, emotionally devastating story about needing a bridge loan to save the family legacy. He told her it was a mere formality, a temporary signature on a corporate document that would be removed in 90 days. He weaponized her filial loyalty, crying in front of her, playing the victim of a ruthless banking system. And Chloe, operating entirely behind her husband's back, had signed the guarantee documents. Mark stood in his perfect, mid-century modern living room, the absolute silence ringing in his ears, as Arthur delivered the killing blow. The hard money lenders were not just coming after Arthur. Because Chloe had signed as a guarantor, and because Colorado operates under specific marital property laws regarding jointly held assets, the lending syndicate had legally attached a massive, aggressive lien against the Cherry Creek house. The sanctuary was breached. The fortress was compromised. Arthur looked Mark dead in the eye and, with a terrifying, sociopathic calmness, stated that the only mathematical way to stop the syndicate from foreclosing on the home and dragging Mark into a decade of ruinous federal litigation was to voluntarily liquidate the asset. Arthur was demanding that Mark sell his house, the house he had bled for 10 years to build, to pay off a $1.2 million gambling debt incurred by a father-in-law he despised, all because his wife had committed an act of absolute, unforgivable financial treason. When a structural engineer looks at a collapsed building, they do not look at the shattered glass or the decorative facade scattered across the street. They look directly at the foundation. They look for the exact point of critical stress where the concrete failed, because in the physical world, destruction is never spontaneous. It is always the mathematical result of a weakness that was either ignored or deliberately concealed. Mark stood in his pristine, mid-century modern living room, the custom lighting casting long, cold shadows across the hardwood floor, and he did not look at Arthur's panicked, graying face. He looked at Chloe. He looked at the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman he had trusted with his complete financial and emotional vulnerability, and he realized that she was the critical point of failure. The American marriage is built on a very specific legal and psychological contract. We pool our resources, we combine our credit scores, and we operate under the assumption that our spouse is a co-pilot navigating the treacherous airspace of the American economy. But financial infidelity is a silent, sociopathic cancer that completely eviscerates that contract. When one partner covertly funnels the security of the household to satisfy the demands of a toxic parent, They are not just making a mistake. They are actively opening the gates of the fortress to let the barbarians inside. The silence in the room was not peaceful. It was the suffocating silence of a vacuum right before an implosion. Chloe was weeping silently on the expensive linen sofa, her tears staining the upholstery, waiting for her husband to explode. Arthur was still talking, his voice a frantic, pathetic drone, trying to use words like liquidity, temporary leveraging, and market corrections to soften the reality that he had just detonated a $1.2 million bomb in Mark's living room. But Mark did not scream. He did not throw a punch. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the betrayal short-circuited the emotional centers of his brain and activated the cold, calculating machinery of his engineering mind. He walked over to the coffee table, picked up the thick stack of legal documents Arthur had thrown down, and began to read. He did not read the summary. He read the fine print. He read the dense, unforgiving legalese of the shadow banking syndicate. This brings us to a terrifying reality of the modern American financial landscape that most middle-class families completely ignore until it is too late. The syndicate Arthur had borrowed from was not a back-alley loan shark operation. They were a registered, highly sophisticated private equity group operating out of a glass and steel tower in downtown Denver. I want to introduce you to the mechanics of this world through the lens of a man named Vance. 2 days after that catastrophic confrontation in the living room, Mark did not call a divorce lawyer. He took a day off work, put on his only tailored suit, and drove downtown to look his executioners in the eye. He secured a meeting with Vance, the senior portfolio manager of the lending syndicate who held the paper on Arthur's debt. If you expect the villain of this story to be a man breaking kneecaps, you do not understand how money works in this country. Vance was in his late 30s, possessing degrees from Ivy League institutions, wearing a watch that cost more than Mark's first car. His office overlooked the Rocky Mountains, a sterile, beautiful monument to legal extortion. Vance did not treat Mark with aggression. He treated him with the terrifying, polite detachment of a surgeon explaining a terminal diagnosis. When Mark sat down across from the massive mahogany desk, Vance pulled up the digital file of the loan. He explained the concept of hard money lending to Mark with absolute transparency. Vance's firm did not care about Arthur's luxury condominium project. They knew Arthur was a desperate, washed-up gambler with a history of failed developments. They approved the $700,000 loan precisely because they knew Arthur would default. Their entire business model was not built on collecting interest, it was built on underwriting the loan against an asset that was worth significantly more than the principal, and then seizing that asset when the borrower inevitably collapsed. Vance tapped a manicured finger against his computer screen and looked at Mark with cold, reptilian eyes. He stated that they never underwrote the loan based on Arthur's credit. They underwrote it entirely based on the appraised value of Mark's Cherry Creek home. They had sent a shadow appraiser to drive by the property months ago. They knew the equity Mark had painstakingly built. They knew the current market value was hovering around $1.8 million. The syndicate had deliberately crafted a loan with a compounding interest rate so toxic that it was mathematically impossible for Arthur to service the debt, effectively setting a ticking time bomb on Mark's property. Vance slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was the formal notice of intent to foreclose. He told Mark that the syndicate had no interest in negotiating a payment plan. They wanted the house. They wanted to liquidate it, take their $1.2 million, and leave Mark and Chloe with whatever scraps remained after the legal fees. It was a perfectly legal, thoroughly documented, state-sanctioned theft. But Mark, sitting in that high-altitude office, began to process a very specific, glaring structural anomaly in Vance's narrative. Mark was not an attorney, but he was a man who dealt entirely in rigid systems and legal regulations regarding property and engineering contracts. In the state of Colorado, a primary residence purchased during a marriage is subject to very strict homestead protections and marital property laws. A spouse cannot simply sign a piece of paper at a lunch meeting and unilaterally pledge a jointly owned, primary residential asset as collateral for a commercial loan without the explicit, notarized consent of the other spouse. It is a fundamental legal firewall designed specifically to prevent exactly what Arthur and Chloe had allegedly done. The syndicate was a sophisticated operation. Vance was an Ivy League educated executive. They would never risk $1 million loan on a legally defective guarantee. They would know that a single signature from Chloe, without Mark's consent, would render the lien completely unenforceable in a state court, potentially wiping out their entire investment. Mark looked at Vance, the gears in his mind grinding with terrifying speed. He asked Vance, point blank, how the syndicate's legal department had managed to bypass the joint spousal consent requirements to place the lien on the property. Vance's polite demeanor vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise, followed by a cold, condescending smirk. Vance leaned back in his chair and stated that the syndicate never bypasses the law. They require absolute, ironclad documentation. Vance pressed a button on his keyboard, printing out a specific page from the loan origination file, and handed it to Mark. He told Mark that the legal department had absolutely no problem placing the lien, because Mark himself had signed the waiver of homestead rights and the joint collateral agreement. The air in the sterile office seemed to instantly freeze. Mark stared at the piece of paper in his hands. It was a standard, state-issued legal waiver. At the bottom of the page, above the line designated for the primary property owner, was a signature. It was his signature. The loop of the M, the sharp, aggressive slant of the K, it was a near-perfect replica of his handwriting. And right next to it, stamped in heavy black ink, was the official seal of a licensed Colorado notary public, verifying that Mark had appeared in person, presented government-issued identification, and willingly signed away the legal protection of his home to secure a loan for his father-in-law. The psychological devastation of this moment is almost impossible to articulate. Betrayal is a terrible thing, but realizing that your betrayal was orchestrated through the commission of a massive state felony fundamentally shatters your perception of reality. Mark had not signed that document. He had been out of state, inspecting bridges in Wyoming on the date stamped by the notary. The signature was a highly practiced, deliberate forgery. Mark walked out of the glass tower in downtown Denver, the noise of the city traffic hitting him like a physical blow. The narrative he had been operating under for the past 48 hours was completely dead. Chloe was not just a naive, emotionally manipulated daughter who had made a foolish financial mistake over a salad at lunch. She was an active participant in a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar financial fraud. But a structural engineer knows that a single compromised pillar does not usually execute a complex failure on its own. It requires an external force. Chloe did not have the legal knowledge, the criminal network, or the sheer sociopathic nerve to forge a notarized legal document and bypass the underwriting department of a ruthless shadow banking syndicate. Someone had to guide her. Someone had to provide the corrupt notary. Someone had to be the architect of the forgery. And that is when the second hidden figure in this catastrophe emerged from the shadows. To understand the depth of Arthur's depravity, you have to look beyond his relationship with his daughter and look at the company he kept in the dark corners of the Denver real estate underworld. Mark spent the next 3 days diving into the public county records, pulling the licensing information of the notary who had stamped the forged document, and tracing the corporate structure of Arthur's doomed luxury condominium project. The trail of digital breadcrumbs did not lead to a sophisticated mafia. It led to a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor was a 45-year-old independent mortgage broker and title agent who operated out of a strip mall office in a decaying suburb of Denver. She was not Arthur's wife, nor was she merely a business associate. She was Arthur's secret weapon, his financial enabler, and his clandestine romantic partner. Eleanor possessed a deep, encyclopedic knowledge of the loopholes, the gray areas, and the outright illegal maneuvers that could be executed within the Colorado real estate system. She catered to desperate men who needed to move money quickly without leaving a clean paper trail. When Arthur's legitimate credit completely evaporated, Eleanor was the one who introduced him to Vance and the Shadow Syndicate. She was the one who structured the loan application. But Eleanor was not a charity worker. She was a predator who saw a massive, untapped gold mine in Arthur's relationship with his daughter. Through his investigations, Mark uncovered the terrifying, premeditated reality of the crime. Eleanor had actually been the one to appraise the Cherry Creek house. Driving by Mark's property to calculate the exact equity available for extraction, Eleanor knew that Mark would never willingly sign the collateral documents. So, she utilized her connections in the title industry to procure a corrupt notary, a woman whose license had previously been flagged for ethical violations but was still technically active. Eleanor was the one who instructed Arthur on how to manipulate Chloe. The psychological grooming that led to the forgery was a masterpiece of domestic terrorism. Mark confronted Chloe on a Friday night, the house completely dark except for the harsh glare of the kitchen island lights. He did not yell. He placed the printed copy of the forged, notarized waiver on the marble countertop. He watched the color completely drain from his wife's face. The human brain, when confronted with undeniable proof of its own monstrosity, often attempts to retreat into a state of infantile victimhood. Chloe collapsed to the floor, sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands. She finally confessed to the mechanics of the betrayal. And the story she told was a chilling testament to the destructive power of the narcissistic father. Arthur had not just cried at lunch. He had brought Eleanor with him. Eleanor had played the role of the sympathetic financial savior, validating Arthur's genius and confirming that the condominium project was a guaranteed massive success. They presented Chloe with a stack of documents 50 pages deep, intentionally burying the homestead waiver and the collateral guarantee in the middle. Arthur had told his daughter that the syndicate required her signature as a character reference for his corporate entity. But the forgery of Mark's signature was not an accident of paperwork. When they reached the page requiring the primary homeowner's consent, Arthur had looked at Chloe, his eyes entirely devoid of paternal love, and told her that Mark was too rigid, too small-minded to understand the brilliance of the deal. He told her that if she truly loved her father, if she wanted to save him from absolute ruin and potential imprisonment for past debts, she needed to practice Mark's signature. Eleanor had stood right there, handing Chloe a pen and a blank piece of paper, coaching her on the specific slant of the letters. The corrupt notary was waiting in the car outside the restaurant to stamp the document the second the ink was dry. Chloe, the woman Mark shared a bed with, the woman he was planning to have children with, had spent 20 minutes in a high-end Denver restaurant practicing her husband's signature until it was perfect enough to steal his home. She had executed a multi-million-dollar state felony against her own husband, completely sacrificing his 10 years of grueling labor to buy her father another few months of pretending to be a rich man. Mark stood over his weeping wife, feeling an icy, terrifying void open up in his chest. In the psychology of betrayal, this is the point of no return. You cannot repair a foundation that has been deliberately pulverized by the people living inside the house. The narrative had completely shifted. Mark was no longer fighting a bad financial decision. He was locked in a hostage situation. He looked down at the forged document, realizing the absolute, devastating trap that Arthur and Eleanor had engineered. It was a masterpiece of sociopathic leverage. If Mark went to the police, if he filed a formal report with the Colorado Attorney General's office declaring the signature a forgery, he would immediately invalidate the syndicate's lien on his property. His house would be saved. The $1.2 million debt would snap back entirely onto Arthur. But the legal consequences of that action were absolute and unavoidable. To prove the forgery, the authorities would pull the notary records, they would pull the restaurant security footage, and they would interrogate the parties involved. Chloe would not be treated as a naive victim. In the eyes of the federal and state prosecutors, she was a willing co-conspirator in a massive mortgage fraud scheme. If Mark defended his property, he would be the primary witness sending his own wife to a state penitentiary for up to a decade. He would be initiating the criminal destruction of his own family. But if he remained silent, if he refused to file the police report to protect Chloe from prison, he would be legally acknowledging the validity of the forged document. The syndicate would foreclose on the house, seize his entire net worth, and throw him out onto the street. He would be forced to pay off a massive, predatory gambling debt incurred by a sociopath, completely destroying his own financial future, his credit score, and his sanity, all to protect the woman who had happily handed him over to the executioner. Arthur had known exactly what he was doing. He had deliberately used Chloe's hand to forge the signature, knowing that Mark's rigid, protective nature would paralyze him. Arthur had built a bomb, strapped it to his own daughter's chest, and handed the detonator to Mark, daring him to push the button. Mark was standing in the beautiful, mid-century modern kitchen he had designed, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his life's work, realizing that the American legal system does not care about broken hearts. It only cares about signatures, and his signature, forged by the woman sobbing at his feet, had just condemned him to hell. There is a specific, agonizing paralysis that sets in when a human being realizes they have been engineered into a perfect, inescapable trap by the people they love. In the field of criminal psychology, we analyze the concept of the hostage situation. When a stranger holds a gun to your head in a bank, the dynamic is terrifying but mathematically simple. You comply to survive, or you fight to escape. But what happens when the hostage taker is your own wife, and the weapon she is holding to your head is her own freedom? Mark stood in the center of his pristine kitchen, looking down at Chloe sobbing on the floor, and he felt the fundamental architecture of his reality completely collapse. Arthur, the sociopathic patriarch, had not merely stolen Mark's equity. He had weaponized the American legal system against Mark's own moral compass. Arthur knew that Mark was a protector. He knew that Mark was a man of rigorous principles, a man who believed that a husband's primary duty was to shield his family from destruction. By forcing Chloe to forge that signature, Arthur had effectively taken Mark's protective instinct and turned it into a suicide vest. If Mark went to the authorities to save his house, he would be the primary witness sending his wife to a federal penitentiary for mortgage fraud and identity theft. He would be the executioner of his own marriage. But if he did nothing, if he absorbed the blow to protect her, he would be financially annihilated, forced to surrender the sanctuary he had bled for 10 years to build, all to satisfy the predatory gambling debts of a man he despised. This is the dark, silent violence of the American family unit. We are culturally conditioned to believe that love requires absolute sacrifice, that a good man will always fall on his sword to protect his household. Narcissists like Arthur understand this cultural conditioning perfectly. They do not view a good man as a person, they view him as a resource to be mined, a human shield to be deployed when their own reckless decisions finally catch up to them. Arthur was banking on Mark's decency to pay off his $1.2 million debt. I want you to deeply analyze the tears streaming down Chloe's face as she sat on the kitchen floor. When a betrayal of this magnitude is uncovered, the immediate reaction of the perpetrator is almost always a violent, theatrical display of infantile weeping. We are socially programmed to view tears as a sign of genuine remorse. But when you spend years studying the mechanics of deception, you learn to differentiate between the tears of a person who is heartbroken over the pain they have caused, and the tears of a predator who is simply terrified of the consequences of getting caught. Chloe was not crying because she had destroyed her husband's life. If she truly cared about Mark's life, she never would have sat in that high-end Denver restaurant and practiced forging his signature 20 times on a napkin. She was crying because the protective bubble of her delusion had violently popped. She was crying because she was looking down the barrel of a state felony charge. She was using her emotional collapse as a shield, subconsciously demanding that Mark suppress his own completely justified rage to comfort her, to manage her anxiety, and to fix the catastrophic mess she had created. Mark, operating with the cold, hyper-vigilant clarity of a structural engineer, assessing a collapsed bridge, recognized the manipulation immediately. He realized that comforting her, telling her that they would figure it out together, would be an act of profound self-betrayal. It would validate her action. So, Mark did something terrifying. He did absolutely nothing. He did not reach out to touch her. He did not raise his voice. He simply stared at her with a dead, hollow expression, watching her sob until the silence in the room became so heavy and suffocating that her tears eventually dried up, replaced by a deep, primal fear of the stranger standing before her. Mark picked up the forged document, neatly folded it into his jacket pocket, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving his wife sitting alone in the wreckage of her own making. When a man's foundation is shattered, he has two choices. He can let the building crush him. Or he can meticulously analyze the rubble to understand exactly how the explosives were planted. Mark chose the latter. He refused to be the sacrificial lamb in Arthur's sociopathic drama. He needed to understand the exact mechanics of the theft. The narrative Arthur had spun, the story of a luxury condominium project ruined by a sudden market downturn, felt structurally unsound. Shadow banking syndicates do not hand over $700,000 to a washed-up former broker without a highly detailed, verifiable business plan, even with a stolen house as collateral. The money had to go somewhere. The loan had been dispersed. The debt had ballooned. But where were the materials? Where was the concrete? Where was the steel? To hunt predators operating in the gray areas of the American financial system, you cannot use conventional law enforcement. The police are bogged down by bureaucracy and require absolute proof of a crime before they even open a file. Mark needed a specialist. He needed someone who understood the dark architecture of corporate fraud. Through a contact in the commercial construction industry, Mark was introduced to Elias. Elias was a 55-year-old former corporate litigator who had been quietly disbarred a decade ago for crossing ethical lines to destroy a rival firm. He now operated out of a windowless office in an industrial park in Aurora, Colorado, working as a private financial investigator for high-net-worth clients who needed to solve catastrophic problems completely off the books. Elias was a cynic, a man who viewed human morality as a highly flexible illusion. When Mark sat down in Elias's office and laid out the forged document, the Shadow Syndicate's foreclosure notice, and the cast of characters involving Arthur and Eleanor, Elias did not express shock. He simply lit a cigarette, ignoring the building's fire code, and told Mark that he was looking at a classic extraction play. Elias explained the grim reality of the Denver speculative real estate market. He told Mark that men like Arthur do not build condominiums. They build paper castles. The entire concept of the luxury development was likely a massive, fabricated smoke screen designed specifically to justify the massive loan from the syndicate. Elias took Mark's retainer, a significant chunk of Mark's remaining liquid savings, and initiated a deep, forensic dive into the corporate filings, the zoning permits, and the municipal records surrounding Arthur's supposed project. 3 days later, Elias summoned Mark to an address on the rapidly gentrifying outskirts of the city. Mark parked his car on a crumbling asphalt shoulder and walked over to where Elias was leaning against the hood of a battered SUV. Elias pointed a calloused finger at a sprawling, empty dirt lot surrounded by a chain-link fence. Weeds were growing waist-high. There was no heavy machinery. There were no survey stakes. There was absolutely no sign of human activity. Elias handed Mark a manila folder containing the municipal zoning reports. Arthur had indeed purchased the dirt lot 2 years ago using a highly leveraged, high-interest bridge loan, but he had never filed a single permit for construction. He had never hired an architectural firm. He had never engaged a general contractor. The luxury condominium project was a complete, verifiable phantom. The psychological impact of staring at that empty dirt lot was profound. Mark realized that Arthur had never intended to build anything. The loan from the Shadow Syndicate, the $700,000 secured by forging Mark's signature, was never meant to be invested into a legitimate business venture. It was a smash-and-grab operation. Arthur and Eleanor had essentially used Chloe as a lockpick to break into Mark's vault, scooped out the equity he had spent 10 years building, and walked away. But if the money did not go into the dirt lot, where did it go? $700,000 does not just evaporate into the thin air of the Rocky Mountains, it leaves a paper trail, even when it is routed through the dark corners of the shadow economy. This is where Eleanor's specific skill set as a corrupt mortgage broker and title agent became terrifyingly clear. Elias, utilizing a network of contacts within the banking industry that operated far outside the boundaries of legal data privacy, began tracking the wire transfers initiated by the Shadow Syndicate on the day the loan was finalized. The money had hit Arthur's corporate LLC account and remained there for exactly 48 hours, just long enough to satisfy the legal requirements of the commercial loan dispersal. Then, the capital began to violently splinter. Elias tracked a series of rapid, complex wire transfers moving the funds out of Colorado entirely. The money was funneled through 3 different shell companies registered in Delaware, a state notorious for its corporate anonymity laws. But Elias was relentless. He peeled back the layers of the corporate veil and followed the capital all the way down to the humid, tax-friendly swamps of the American South. Elias called Mark into his office late on a Thursday night. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the adrenaline of a successful hunt. Elias had printed out a massive, high-resolution satellite image and pinned it to a corkboard on the wall. The image showed a stunning, sprawling waterfront estate located in a highly exclusive, gated community in Naples, Florida. The property featured a private boat dock, a massive infinity pool, and pristine manicured grounds. Elias looked at Mark, his eyes completely devoid of sympathy, and delivered the devastating truth. The estate had been purchased in cash, exactly 3 weeks after the Shadow Syndicate dispersed the loan against Mark's house. The purchase price was precisely $650,000, and the deed to the property was not registered under Arthur's name. It was registered to an irrevocable family trust overseen entirely by Eleanor. The sheer, sociopathic brilliance of the scheme was breathtaking. Arthur and Eleanor knew that Arthur's financial history was a ticking time bomb. They knew he was unbankable. They knew the syndicate would eventually foreclose. So, they engineered a massive, state-sanctioned heist. They used Chloe to steal Mark's house, took the cash from the syndicate, and immediately funneled it into a luxury property in Florida. Florida is a state legendary for its absolute, unbreakable homestead protection laws. In Florida, a primary residence is completely shielded from civil judgments and creditors. Even when the Shadow Syndicate foreclosed on Mark's house in Denver, even if they sued Arthur for the remaining balance of the ballooning interest, they could not touch the estate in Naples. Arthur and Eleanor had essentially stolen Mark's life savings to purchase a permanent, untouchable retirement compound in the sun, knowing perfectly well that Mark would be the one completely crushed by the collapsing Denver real estate trap they left behind. Mark sat in Elias's office, staring at the satellite image of the Florida estate, feeling a cold, dark void expanding in his chest. He was looking at the physical manifestation of his own stolen future. He had spent 10 years working 80-hour weeks, denying himself vacations, driving a beat-up car, all to build a foundation that had been effortlessly liquidated to buy a swimming pool for a corrupt title agent and a washed-up gambler. But as devastating as the Florida revelation was, it was not the darkest truth Elias had uncovered. In the world of complex financial fraud, there is always a ledger. There is always an accounting of who got paid to facilitate the crime. Elias sat down heavily behind his desk, pushing a thin stack of bank statements across the surface toward Mark. Elias did not look triumphant anymore. He looked like a man who was about to deliver a fatal blow. Elias explained that he had accounted for $650,000 of the syndicate's loan. But the total loan dispersal was $700,000. There was a missing $50,000 that had not been wired to the Delaware shell companies. Elias had tracked that specific, isolated sum. It had been routed back into the local Denver banking system, deposited into a specific, private checking account exactly 48 hours after Chloe had sat in that restaurant and forged her husband's signature. Mark reached out with trembling hands and pulled the bank statements closer. He looked at the name registered on the checking account receiving the $50,000 wire. It was Chloe's name. The fundamental reality of Mark's marriage, the entire psychological framework he had been operating under since the night Chloe collapsed on the kitchen floor, violently imploded. Chloe was not a hostage. She was a mercenary. For the entirety of their relationship, Chloe had presented herself as a successful, independent freelance interior designer. She constantly talked about her high-end clients, her exclusive fabric sourcing trips, and her booming boutique business. But the forensic accounting laid bare a terrifying, pathetic reality. Chloe's interior design business was an absolute, catastrophic failure. She had absolutely no high-end clients. She was drowning in massive, high-interest business credit card debt, actively hiding a terrifying financial ruin from her husband. She was desperately trying to maintain the illusion of the wealthy, successful daughter of a real estate titan, a psychological sickness she had inherited directly from Arthur. The narrative of the emotionally manipulated daughter desperately trying to save her father from ruin was a complete, fabricated lie designed to manipulate Mark's protective instincts. Arthur did not just cry at that lunch meeting. He offered a transaction. He knew his daughter was secretly drowning in debt. He knew she was terrified that Mark, the rigid, mathematically precise, structural engineer, would discover her financial failures and leave her. So, Arthur offered her a bailout. He told her that if she forged Mark's signature on the Shadow Syndicate documents, allowing him and Eleanor to extract the massive loan, he would carve out $50,000 of the stolen money and secretly wire it to her failing business accounts. Chloe did not forge the signature to save her father's life. She forged the signature, deliberately placing a $1.2 million ticking time bomb on her husband's sanctuary, to secretly wipe out her own credit card debt and maintain the illusion of her successful career. She had sold her husband's entire future, his 10 years of grueling labor, and his psychological safety for $50,000. She was not a victim of her father's sociopathy. She was an active, willing participant in the exact same strain of narcissistic greed. She was Arthur's daughter, through and through. Mark sat in the windowless office, the hum of the fluorescent lights sounding like a deafening roar in his ears. The woman he loved did not exist. The marriage was merely a convenient, protective shell she used to house her own deceptions. When she had wept on the kitchen floor, she was not crying because her father had ruined them. She was crying because the syndicate had finally called the note, and her complicity, her horrific, selfish transaction, was about to be exposed to the one man she relied on for survival. Elias watched Mark process the total annihilation of his life. The cynical investigator had seen marriages destroyed over money thousands of times, but the sheer, surgical cruelty of a wife actively participating in the financial execution of her husband to cover her own shopping debts was uniquely grotesque. Elias leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of emotion, and laid out the terrifying reality of Mark's current legal standing. Elias told Mark that they were operating in a completely different paradigm now. This was no longer about protecting a naive wife from the consequences of a mistake. This was about surviving an active assassination attempt by a criminal syndicate that happened to include his spouse. Elias stated that if Mark confronted Chloe with the bank statements, she would instantly realize that the narrative of the innocent victim was dead. A cornered narcissist who realizes they have lost control of the narrative is the most dangerous entity on the planet. If Chloe felt that Mark was going to expose her $50,000 payoff to the authorities to invalidate the forged lien, she would strike first. She would run straight to a ruthless divorce attorney, file domestic violence restraining orders to force him out of the house, and immediately file for aggressive spousal support, locking him in a terrifying, multi-year legal meat grinder while the Shadow Syndicate simultaneously foreclosed on the property. Mark would be fighting a two-front war against apex predators, bleeding out legal fees until he was completely bankrupt and living in his car. Mark stood up from the desk, leaving the satellite images of the Florida estate and the bank statements documenting his wife's treason scattered across the wood. The structural engineer had found the exact point of critical failure. The foundation of his life was built on a bed of lies, and the people he trusted most were actively cheering for the collapse. He realized that the American legal system was a massive, blind machine that rewarded whoever controlled the paperwork first. He could not afford to be angry. He could not afford to be heartbroken. He had to become something entirely different. He had to become a demolition expert. He walked out of Elias's office into the freezing Colorado night, knowing that he had to return to that mid-century modern house, slide into bed next to the woman who had sold him to the slaughterhouse, and smile as if he believed every single one of her tears. The hostage had decided to stop negotiating, and the meticulous, terrifying architecture of his revenge was already beginning to form in the cold, dark spaces of his mind. The most dangerous place in the world is not a dark alley in a bad neighborhood. It is the absolute center of your own bed, lying awake at 3 a.m, listening to the rhythmic breathing of a person who has actively plotted your destruction. When Mark returned to his mid-century modern home in Cherry Creek that night, he performed the most grueling, terrifying acting job of his entire life. He walked into the kitchen, picked his weeping wife up off the floor, and held her. He smoothed her hair. He told her that he loved her, that a house was just wood and glass, and that they would find a way to survive Arthur's terrible mistake together. He felt Chloe's body relax against his chest. He felt the tension leave her shoulders as she believed she had successfully manipulated him into absolute compliance. But as Mark stared over her shoulder at the pristine, custom-built kitchen cabinets he had painstakingly designed, he was not a husband comforting a wife. He was an engineer conducting a structural stress test on a building he was about to demolish. To destroy a sociopath who is utilizing the American legal system as a weapon, you cannot fight them in the courtroom. The courtroom is their natural habitat. It is an arena built on delays, appeals, and the deliberate exhaustion of the victim's financial resources. If Mark filed a police report for the forged signature, he would enter a multi-year legal meat grinder, paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees just to prove he was innocent, while his wife played the victim card to a sympathetic judge. Mark realized that Vance, the Ivy League predator at the shadow banking syndicate, and Chloe, the mercenary operating inside his own house, shared one fundamental, fatal weakness. Their entire sense of power was derived from the physical value of the collateral. The syndicate held a $1.2 million lien against a house appraised at $1.8 million. They believed they were holding a winning lottery ticket. Chloe believed that by sacrificing the house, she had legally washed her hands of her debts and secured her secret payoff. They all viewed the Cherry Creek house as an unshakable, liquid asset. But Mark was a structural engineer. He understood a terrifying truth about real estate that bankers and interior designers fundamentally ignore. A house is not a number on a spreadsheet. It is a physical object bound by the laws of physics and municipal zoning codes. And if you understand the physics of a structure, you understand exactly how to legally murder it. Mark spent the next 3 weeks playing the role of the defeated, paralyzed husband. He went to work. He ate dinner with Chloe. He allowed the shadow syndicate to file the official notice of foreclosure with the county clerk. He let them believe he was surrendering. But every night, after Chloe went to sleep, Mark slipped down into the massive, unfinished crawlspace beneath the house. Cherry Creek is a neighborhood built on a very specific type of geological terrain, prone to expansive soils and subterranean water movement. When Mark originally bought the house, he had spent $50,000 installing a state-of-the-art, high-capacity sump pump and subterranean drainage system to manage the extreme hydrostatic pressure pushing against the foundation. It was the invisible heart keeping the house alive, completely hidden from the naked eye. Over the course of those 3 weeks, operating in absolute silence with a headlamp and heavy tools, Mark systematically dismantled the structural integrity of his own sanctuary. He did not just turn the pumps off. That would be too obvious. He meticulously rerouted the drainage pipes to discharge directly into the soil beneath the primary load-bearing pillars. He introduced microscopic, calculated fractures into the concrete retaining walls using a hydraulic jack, mimicking the natural, catastrophic failure of foundation shear. He intentionally compromised the vapor barriers, allowing the massive influx of subterranean moisture to bloom rapidly within the walls. He was engineering a highly accelerated, completely verifiable structural death. He was turning a $1.8 million luxury asset into a toxic, condemned hazard. The beauty of engineering is that it relies entirely on objective reality. When the damage was irreversible, when the hairline fractures in the drywall began to visibly spiderweb across the living room and the floorboards began to noticeably buckle, Mark executed the second phase of his demolition. He did not call Vance. He called the City of Denver Department of Building and Safety. He filed an emergency structural hazard report, utilizing his own credentials as a licensed commercial structural engineer to prioritize the inspection. When the municipal inspectors arrived at the Cherry Creek property on a rainy Tuesday morning, they were horrified. The inspectors descended into the crawlspace and found a foundation that was actively collapsing under the weight of severe hydrostatic pressure. They found black mold aggressively colonizing the compromised drywall. Because Mark had engineered the damage to perfectly mimic a sudden, catastrophic geological failure, the city inspectors did not see vandalism. They saw an imminent threat to human life. Within 4 hours of their arrival, the city officials hammered a massive, neon red tag onto the beautiful mahogany front door. The red tag is the ultimate, nuclear option in the world of real estate. It signifies that the property is officially condemned. It is legally uninhabitable. It cannot be occupied, it cannot be insured, and most importantly, it cannot be sold on the open market. The city mandated an immediate evacuation and issued a public abatement order requiring the structure to be either completely demolished or subjected to $1 million foundational replacement before anyone could step foot inside it. Again, the $1.8 million asset was instantly vaporized, transformed into a massive, toxic liability. The psychological collapse of the shadow banking syndicate was a masterpiece of corporate panic. When a lender forecloses on a property, they legally assume all the liabilities attached to that property. Vance and his team of Ivy League executives were sitting in their glass tower, expecting to seize a pristine luxury home, polish it, and flip it for a massive profit. Instead, They received a certified legal notice from the city of Denver informing them that the collateral they were actively foreclosing on was a condemned biohazard. If the syndicate took possession of the deed, they would be legally responsible for the city-mandated demolition costs, the environmental remediation, and the massive municipal fines accruing every single day the house sat abandoned. Vance's $1.2 million predatory loan was now secured by a pile of toxic rubble that would cost him another $500,000 just to clean up. Vance called Mark's cell phone 87 times in a span of 3 hours. Mark did not answer a single call. Instead, he packed a single duffel bag, walked out of the red-tagged house, and drove downtown to the syndicate's headquarters. He did not wear a suit this time. He wore his work boots and a faded canvas jacket. When Mark walked into Vance's corner office, the polished, condescending portfolio manager was hyperventilating, surrounded by his own frantic legal team. Vance screamed at Mark, accusing him of insurance fraud, of sabotage, threatening to unleash the full fury of his corporate litigators. Mark stood perfectly still, letting the Ivy League predator scream until his voice cracked. Then, Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, heavily stamped with the logo of Elias's private investigation firm. Mark dropped the envelope onto Vance's mahogany desk. He did not defend the house. He did not deny the sabotage. He simply looked at Vance with the dead, terrifying eyes of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and he offered Vance a target. Mark explained to Vance, in a low, even voice, that suing a structural engineer for a geological foundation failure is a legal impossibility that would take 10 years and cost millions in expert testimony. He told Vance that the collateral was dead and buried. But, Mark continued, he knew exactly where the principal cash of the loan had gone. He told Vance that if he opened the envelope, he would find the exact wire transfer receipts, the Delaware Shell Company registrations, and the high-resolution satellite imagery of the Florida estate purchased with the syndicate's money. Vance's hands were shaking as he opened the envelope. The corporate lawyers in the room crowded around the desk, their eyes widening as they read the forensic accounting provided by Elias. They realized instantly that they had been the victims of a highly orchestrated mortgage fraud scheme executed by a corrupt title agent and a washed-up broker. But Mark was not finished. He leaned over the desk, invading Vance's personal space, and delivered the ultimate, Machiavellian stroke. He informed Vance that Florida's homestead exemption laws protected the property from traditional civil judgments. However, Mark pointed out, the syndicate was not a traditional bank, and Vance was not a traditional banker. Mark told them that the envelope also contained undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and interstate money laundering. Mark was handing the syndicate the exact legal ammunition they needed to bypass the civil courts, pierce the corporate veil of the Florida Trust, and initiate a federal RICO investigation against Arthur and Eleanor. He was weaponizing the ruthless, predatory nature of the shadow bankers against the very people who had stolen their money. Mark was turning the wolves loose on his own family. Vance looked up from the documents, the color completely drained from his face. He realized that Mark was not a victim seeking justice. Mark was an executioner utilizing the syndicate as his firing squad. Vance slowly nodded, a silent agreement forged in the dark, unregulated waters of absolute financial destruction. Mark turned around and walked out of the glass tower, leaving the predators to tear each other apart. The final confrontation of this nightmare occurred in the parking lot of a cheap motel on the outskirts of Denver, where Mark had directed Chloe to meet him after the city inspectors forced her to evacuate the house. Chloe was standing in the freezing rain next to her car, wrapped in an expensive cashmere coat, staring at her phone in absolute panic. She had expected to execute her betrayal smoothly, writing out the foreclosure while playing the supportive wife, only to quietly file for divorce and slip away to her secret life once the dust settled. The sudden, violent condemnation of the house had completely derailed her meticulously constructed narrative. When Mark pulled into the parking lot and stepped out of his truck, Chloe ran toward him, her face a mask of manufactured hysteria. She began screaming about the city inspectors, about the red tag on the door, demanding to know how their perfect house had collapsed overnight. She was desperately trying to maintain the illusion that they were a team fighting a tragic, unexpected disaster. Mark did not embrace her. He stopped 3 feet away, letting the freezing rain wash over him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a divorce petition. It was the bank statement Elias had procured. The statement explicitly highlighting the $50,000 wire transfer into Chloe's secret checking account, deposited exactly 48 hours after she had forged his signature. Mark held the paper out in the rain. Chloe stopped screaming. The silence that fell over the motel parking lot was heavier than a collapsed building. She stared at the bank statement, the physical proof of her mercenary treason fluttering in the wind. The cashmere coat suddenly looked pathetic. Her entire carefully curated persona of the innocent, manipulated daughter shattered instantly, exposing the cold, calculating void underneath. She realized that Mark had known for weeks. She realized that every time he had held her, every time he had comforted her in that house, he had been looking at a monster. Chloe tried to deploy her final defense mechanism. She tried to revert to the script. She began to stammer, claiming that Arthur had forced her to take the money, that she had been terrified, that the $50,000 was just a desperate attempt to fix her failing business so Mark would not be ashamed of her. She was throwing her father under the bus to save herself, utilizing the exact same sociopathic survival instincts that defined her bloodline. But Mark shook his head. His expression was completely devoid of anger. It was the face of a man looking at an autopsy photograph. He told Chloe to stop talking. He told her that he had spent the last 3 weeks doing a lot more than just tearing down the foundation of their house. He told her that Elias was an incredibly thorough investigator. And that is when Mark dropped the ultimate, world-shattering truth, the final revelation that completely rewrote the entire architecture of the crime and exposed Chloe as one of the most terrifying, apex predators in the American psychological landscape. Mark stepped closer to his wife, his voice barely above a whisper over the sound of the rain. He told her that Elias had dug past the shell companies, past Eleanor's corrupt title agency, and had pulled the actual, highly encrypted legal charter of the irrevocable family trust that owned the sprawling waterfront estate in Florida. Mark looked deeply into Chloe's terrified eyes and stated the undeniable fact. Arthur was not the primary beneficiary of that trust. Eleanor was not the primary beneficiary. Arthur was completely bankrupt, carrying millions in federal tax liens, making it legally impossible for him to own an asset of that magnitude without the government seizing it immediately. Arthur was nothing more than a desperate, pathetic front man, a loud distraction designed to draw all the legal and financial fire. The sole, exclusive, and irrevocable owner of the Florida estate, the legal entity controlling every single cent of the stolen $1.2 million, was Chloe. The sheer, breathtaking scale of her sociopathy finally materialized. Chloe had not been groomed or manipulated by her father to forge that signature. She was the architect. Chloe had realized years ago that Mark's rigid financial principles would never allow her to live the obscenely wealthy, debt-fueled lifestyle she felt she was entitled to. She knew her interior design business was a humiliating failure. She knew Mark would eventually discover her massive secret debts and divorce her, leaving her with half of the equity at best. So, she decided to take all of it. Chloe had orchestrated the entire syndicate loan. She had gone to Eleanor. She had used her father's well-documented history of gambling and failure as the perfect, believable cover story. She instructed Arthur to act desperate, to play the role of the ruined patriarch, knowing that Mark would instantly believe Arthur was the villain because Arthur had always been a villain. Chloe had intentionally forged the signature, fully expecting the syndicate to foreclose, fully expecting Mark to be financially annihilated and tied up in a decade of defensive litigation against the shadow bankers. The $50,000 wire transfer was just a temporary cash injection to cover her tracks and pay a high-powered divorce attorney. Her ultimate plan was to play the traumatized wife, file for divorce claiming extreme emotional distress from the foreclosure, and quietly relocate to her untouchable, multi-million-dollar compound in Florida, leaving Mark homeless, bankrupt, and completely destroyed. She had weaponized the sociological narrative of the abused, manipulated daughter to commit the perfect, untraceable white-collar heist against her own husband. She was a psychopath wrapped in cashmere. Chloe stood in the freezing rain, her mouth open, but absolutely no sound came out. The illusion of her victimhood was completely, violently eradicated. She was stripped bare, exposed to the freezing elements and the terrifying reality of her own reflection. Mark did not give her a chance to form a lie. He did not give her a chance to beg. He leaned in and delivered the final sentence of their marriage. He told Chloe that Vance and his team of Ivy League shadow bankers were, at this exact moment, boarding a private jet heading to Naples, Florida. He told her that he had given the syndicate the full, unredacted copy of the trust charter, explicitly identifying her as the sole owner of the stolen funds. He told her that the shadow bankers were not going to use family court. They were going to use federal RICO statutes. They were going to pierce the Florida homestead exemption by proving the house was purchased with the proceeds of felony wire fraud, and they were going to hunt her down like a dog. Mark turned around, walked back to his truck, and climbed into the driver's seat. He did not look back at the woman standing in the rain. He put the truck in drive and pulled out of the motel parking lot, leaving Chloe completely alone in the dark, standing directly in the path of a multi-million-dollar corporate firing squad that she herself had hired. The concept of absolute, total annihilation is something we usually reserve for acts of war or natural disasters, but the American legal system possesses a mechanism of destruction that is far more surgical and infinitely more terrifying. When Mark drove away from that motel parking lot, leaving his wife standing in the freezing Colorado rain, He did not look back in the rearview mirror. He understood that he had just initiated a chain reaction that could not be stopped, a financial and legal avalanche that was going to bury everyone involved. In the field of criminal sociology, there is a fascinating dynamic that occurs when apex predators are forced to turn on each other. Mark had taken the shadow banking syndicate, a group of ruthless, Ivy League-educated extortionists, and pointed them directly at a family of narcissistic sociopaths. He removed himself from the equation entirely, acting not as a participant in the war, but as the architect who had simply locked the doors and set the building on fire. The retaliation from the Shadow Syndicate was a masterpiece of corporate brutality. Vance and his team of executives did not go to the local police department to file a complaint. Local police lacked the jurisdiction, the budget, and the forensic accounting expertise to unravel a multi-state real estate fraud. Vance went directly to the federal level. Utilizing the undeniable proof provided by Mark, the syndicate's massive legal department filed a comprehensive civil racketeering lawsuit in federal court under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, while simultaneously handing the entire dossier of forged documents and wire transfer receipts to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When you commit wire fraud to secure a loan, cross state lines to launder the money, and use the proceeds to purchase real estate through a shell corporation, you are no longer dealing with a simple domestic dispute. You have committed a series of severe federal felonies, and the United States government does not negotiate. Chloe's descent into absolute ruin was swift and completely devoid of dignity. After Mark abandoned her at the motel, her meticulously crafted reality completely disintegrated. The arrogant, entitled interior designer vanished, replaced by a terrified fugitive. She desperately tried to contact Arthur and Eleanor, but predators are incredibly sensitive to shifts in the wind. The moment Arthur realized the syndicate had discovered the Florida Trust, he completely severed contact with his own daughter. He disconnected his phones, abandoned his leased apartment in Denver, and attempted to vanish. Chloe, entirely alone and panicking, made the fatal mistake of trying to access the Florida estate. She maxed out her remaining, heavily burdened credit cards to book a red-eye flight to Naples, believing that if she could just get inside the gates of the compound, the state homestead laws would magically shield her from the impending storm. But the American legal system is explicitly designed to dismantle fraudulent fortresses. When Chloe's taxi pulled up to the security gate of the exclusive waterfront community in Florida, she was not greeted by a sympathetic concierge. She was greeted by federal marshals. The Shadow Syndicate's attorneys had moved with terrifying speed, securing a federal injunction to freeze the irrevocable family trust. Because the federal prosecutors possessed undeniable, documented proof that the estate was purchased entirely with the proceeds of felony wire fraud and identity theft, the absolute protection of the Florida homestead exemption was instantly pierced. The federal government seized the property under civil asset forfeiture laws before Chloe even stepped foot on the driveway. She was arrested right there on the pristine, palm tree-lined street, standing in the sweltering Florida heat, wearing the same expensive cashmere coat she had worn in the Denver rain, sobbing as cold steel handcuffs were locked around her wrists. The subsequent federal indictments fell like a rain of artillery shells across the Denver real estate underworld. The FBI tracked Arthur down within 48 hours. The former titan of industry, the man who had projected an aura of unshakable wealth and superiority for decades, was found hiding in a cheap, cash-only motel near the Wyoming border, drinking cheap vodka and completely out of his mind with terror. When the federal agents breached his door, the narcissistic facade finally, permanently shattered. Arthur did not mount a heroic legal defense. He collapsed, weeping and hyperventilating, immediately offering to testify against his own daughter to save himself, completely ignorant of the fact that Chloe had already offered to testify against him. It was a pathetic, grotesque display of familial cannibalism. But the most devastating legal blow was delivered by Eleanor. The corrupt mortgage broker and title agent was a woman who understood exactly how the system worked. The absolute second she caught wind of the federal indictments, Eleanor did not run. She walked directly into the United States Attorney's office in downtown Denver, accompanied by a high-powered defense attorney, and offered the government the holy grail of corporate fraud investigations. She handed over her encrypted hard drives, containing decades of illegal transactions, forged appraisals, and corrupt notary logs involving dozens of high-net-worth clients across Colorado. She traded the entire Denver Shadow real estate network for a heavily reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. In doing so, she provided the final nails for the coffins of both Arthur and Chloe. The federal prosecutors did not even need to offer plea deals. The evidence was so overwhelmingly conclusive, so flawlessly documented by the syndicate and Eleanor, that going to trial would have been legal suicide. Arthur, a man whose entire life was built on the desperate manipulation of other people's money, was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. His health rapidly deteriorated behind bars, his ego completely unable to process the reality of being reduced to a mere number in a federal database. He died 3 years into his sentence, completely alone, having alienated every single person he had ever met. Chloe, the architect of her husband's near destruction, faced the terrifying wrath of a federal judge who viewed familial financial treason as a particularly heinous strain of sociopathy. Because she had actively planned the forgery, structured the Florida trust to hoard the stolen capital, and attempted to leave her husband legally and financially ruined, she was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. The woman who had sacrificed her marriage, her morality, and her future for $50,000 to cover her shopping debts was stripped of her expensive clothes, her curated aesthetic, and her freedom. She was reduced to wearing a standard-issue khaki uniform, locked in a concrete cell, forced to spend the next decade contemplating the sheer, breathtaking stupidity of her own greed. The shadow banking syndicate did not escape the blast zone completely unscathed. While they successfully utilized the federal government to seize the Florida estate and recoup the majority of their principal loan, the legal fees they incurred during the multi-state litigation were astronomical. Furthermore, because Mark had officially condemned the Cherry Creek property, creating a massive municipal and environmental hazard, the syndicate was forced to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to safely demolish the house and remediate the subterranean water damage before they could even attempt to sell the empty dirt lot. Vance, the Ivy League portfolio manager who had smugly handed Mark the foreclosure notice, was quietly terminated by the syndicate's board of directors for failing to properly underwrite the collateral and exposing the firm to a massive, public federal investigation. The predators had survived, but they had been severely mauled in the process. But what happens to the man who engineers the demolition? What happens to the structural engineer who intentionally destroys his own sanctuary to survive? Recovery from a betrayal of this magnitude is not a process of healing. It is a process of complete, fundamental reconstruction. Mark did not stay in Denver. The city was tainted. A sprawling monument to the illusions he had desperately tried to believe in. He walked away from the empty dirt lot in Cherry Creek, formally surrendering his claim to the property and allowing the syndicate to absorb the total municipal liability. He filed for a streamlined, uncontested divorce, a process made incredibly simple by the fact that his wife was currently residing in a federal detention center. Mark liquidated his remaining, untethered assets, packed his belongings into his truck, and drove north, leaving the polished, cutthroat world of the Colorado real estate market in his rearview mirror. He relocated to a small, fiercely independent logging town in the dense, evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest. He did not seek out employment at a massive, commercial engineering firm. He opened a small, independent consulting practice, specializing in evaluating the structural integrity of residential properties for working-class families. He traded the high-stakes, multi-million-dollar commercial projects for the quiet, honest work of ensuring that a roof would not collapse under the weight of the winter snow. He lived in a modest, rented cabin, surrounded by ancient pine trees, far away from the toxic, competitive status signaling of the American upper middle class. Psychologists often speak about the concept of the trauma bond, the invisible, suffocating chains that keep victims tied to their abusers. But there is a secondary, equally dangerous psychological trap known as the sunk cost fallacy. It is the belief that because you have invested a massive amount of time, money, and emotional energy into a relationship or a project, you must cling to it, even as it actively destroys you. Mark had invested 10 years of his life, his entire net worth, and his deepest emotional vulnerability into his marriage and his home. The average man would have fought a losing battle in the courts for a decade, slowly bleeding to death financially and psychologically, simply because he could not bear the thought of losing his investment. But Mark's survival was predicated entirely on his ability to recognize a total structural failure and his willingness to walk away from the rubble. He realized that the Cherry Creek house was never truly a sanctuary. It was a beautiful, mid-century modern cage. He realized that the woman he loved was an illusion, a highly customized mask worn by a predator to gain access to his resources. By walking away, by intentionally destroying the very thing the predators were trying to steal, Mark reclaimed his absolute autonomy. He lost his wealth, but he bought back his sanity, his freedom, and his soul. He learned the most terrifying, yet liberating lesson of the modern American landscape. You cannot build a solid foundation with someone who is secretly digging a tunnel underneath it. True security does not come from the deed to a property, a joint bank account, or the legal contract of a marriage. True security comes from the absolute, unshakable knowledge that you possess the intellectual and emotional capacity to survive the complete annihilation of your reality, and the strength to rebuild it on your own terms. As the years passed in the quiet solitude of the Pacific Northwest, Mark found a profound, untouchable peace. He watched the winter storms roll in off the ocean, battering the rugged coastline with terrifying force, and he felt absolutely no fear. He knew exactly how strong his foundation was, because this time, he had poured the concrete himself, and he had not allowed anyone else to hold the blueprints. He had walked through the absolute darkest corridors of human greed and sociopathy, he had looked the monsters directly in the eye, and he had out-engineered them all. This is Tom Hallen, and you have been listening to a story about the devastating illusions of the American dream and the terrifying reality of domestic financial terrorism. The monsters in our society do not always wear ski masks and carry weapons. Sometimes, they wear custom-tailored suits, they share your last name, and they kiss you goodnight while calculating the exact equity of your life's work. If you are listening to this right now, and you feel a strange, cold draft blowing through the foundation of your own life, I urge you to pay attention. Do not ignore the cracks in the wall just because you are terrified of the demolition costs. Sometimes, the only way to save yourself is to strike the match and walk away. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the human condition. If this story made you question the invisible structures in your own life, please hit that subscribe button, leave a 5-star review, and share this podcast with anyone who might need a reality check. Stay sharp. Trust absolutely no one who demands your blind loyalty. And above all else, always inspect your own foundation. Good night, America.